My parents ignored me but paid attention to my brothers. When I inherited $3 million, they started calling me all the time and even tried to sue me. I grew up in what felt like a house without warmth, a place that could hardly be called a home. Everything shifted when my mother remarried. Her new husband, John, was a stern man, adhering firmly to traditional discipline, openly asserting his beliefs without hesitation. He entered my life at the tender age of 10, and it didn't take long for me to realize that I was not a priority in his eyes. Shortly after he moved in, his son Ryan, from a previous marriage, came to live with us. Ryan was the embodiment of everything I was not: charismatic, athletic, and John's pride and joy. My mother, previously attentive and loving, became consumed with pleasing John. Her laughter at his jokes, even the ones that stung, and her quick defense of him whenever I voiced my discomfort, signaled a profound shift in her allegiance. The initial tensions were subtle, yet painful. Ryan would take my belongings without permission, and any attempt to reclaim them resulted in punishment for me. John had a knack for twisting situations to make me seem selfish or dramatic. His favorite rebukes were, "You need to learn to share. That's what families do, and why do you always have to make things so difficult?" My mother, a silent figure in the background, would nod in agreement, as if silenced by her own compromises. As the years passed, the disparities grew. Upon turning 16, Ryan received a car from John, a modest one, yet a significant gift. Meanwhile, I was told to save for my own, met with John's mantra whenever I questioned the fairness: life isn't fair. Complaints were met with reminders of my basic provisions, a roof over my head and food on the table, as though these were luxuries for which I should feel eternally grateful. The irony was stark. I felt anything but lucky. One afternoon, my patience shattered. I returned from school to discover Ryan had raided my room again. My clothes, books, and even some school supplies were gone. When I confronted him, our argument escalated quickly, loud enough to summon John. Without a moment's hesitation, John took Ryan's side, accusing me of always being the trouble. His glare weighed heavily on me as he said, "If you can't live under my rules, maybe you don't belong." That night, as I lay in bed, his words echoed in my mind, intensifying the gnawing feeling of alienation. The thought of leaving, previously a fleeting fantasy, suddenly seemed like a viable escape. Where would I go? What would I do? These questions, once daunting, now felt less confining compared to the daily strife at home. Over the following months, the household tension worsened, John's critiques grew harsher, and my mother's presence became more absent. Each day was a precarious dance on eggshells, with the smallest infractions, like forgetting chores or being slow to clear the dinner table, triggering prolonged lecture. The building resentment inside me was becoming unbearable, yet I felt powerless. After yet another unjust blame during a routine argument, a resolve crystallized within me. I was done. Enduring the constant belittlement, the blatant favoritism, and the persistent feeling of inadequacy had taken its toll. It was time for a change. I began to envision a life of independence. Browsing apartment listings online became my solace, each session a little daydream of freedom. I started saving every dollar I could from my part-time job at the grocery store, with each penny saved marking a step closer to liberation. Then, one transformative afternoon, I found it. A studio apartment within my budget, modestly situated on the town's outskirts. It wasn't much, but it represented something immense. With a racing heart, I filled out the application that very night, daring to hope for a new beginning. A week after applying, the call came through. I was approved. Breaking the news to my mom was the most challenging part. I chose a moment when John and Ryan were out, hoping for a more understanding dialogue. However, her immediate reaction dashed those hopes. The confusion and disappointment were evident on her face. "You're leaving?" she asked incredulously. "Where will you go? How will you manage?" Despite my explanations about my savings and the apartment I had secured, she wouldn't listen. Her objections echoed with concern not for my departure, but for how it would disrupt her life and John's perception. "You're making a mistake," she repeated. "This will just upset John." And there it was, the crux of her distress. It wasn't about my leaving. It was about the impact on her and her marriage. When John learned of my decision, his reaction was tinged with scorn. "So you think you're too good for us?" he sneered. "Go ahead then. Let's see how long you last on your own." I left 2 weeks later on a rain-soaked Saturday morning. Alone, I stuffed all my belongings into a few garbage bags and an old duffel bag, loaded them into the car I had painstakingly saved for, and drove away without a backward glance. The initial months in my new apartment felt almost dreamlike. For the first time, I was accountable to no one, Free from John's tyranny, Ryan's antagonism, and the pervasive feeling of being an intruder in my own home, I relished the autonomy, eating when I wished, coming and going at will, existing without fear of judgment. It was a profound liberation, yet it carried an undertone of fear. I hadn't realized how dependent I had become on the structure of my previous, albeit toxic, life. Now, responsibility loomed large. Managing rent, groceries, and bills was daunting. There were moments of doubt, days I wondered if I had made the right decision. Loneliness crept in, and I missed even the most trivial conversations. But through it all, I held on to the conviction that solitude was preferable to feeling diminished and disregarded back in that suffocating environment. I immersed myself in work, seizing every opportunity for extra shifts. The apartment was modest, but it was mine, and I was fiercely determined to maintain it. Gradually, I began constructing a new existence. Friendships blossomed at work, I ventured out more, and for the first time in a long while, I felt genuinely in charge of my happiness. Yet, the shadows of my past life clung stubbornly. Unexpectedly, raised voices made me flinch, bracing for unjust blame. Doubts about my worth, the nagging feeling that I didn't deserve this newfound tranquility, were tough to dismiss. One quiet evening, as I lounged on my couch with takeout, a message popped up on my phone. It was from my mom. "Can we talk?" I hadn't heard from her since my departure. I paused, the message igniting a tumult of emotions. There was a part of me that longed for the bond we once shared before John's intrusion into our lives, yet resentment simmered within me too, fueled by her failure to defend me, to prevent the escalation of our home's toxic dynamic. I hesitated, unsure if reopening communication was wise. For the moment, I cherished my solitude and the simplicity of the life I had crafted. Nevertheless, her message lingered in my thoughts, a stark reminder that the past wasn't as distant as I hoped. Life had settled into a comfortable pattern over the years since my departure from my mother and John's house. I had carved a niche for myself. My apartment, while humble, was a sanctuary. I took pride in my achievements, a stable job, genuine friendships, and freedom from John's criticisms and Ryan's entitlement. It wasn't flawless, but it was tranquil. Then, as life often does, it threw an unexpected curve. Returning from work one evening, I discovered a letter in my mailbox bearing the seal of a law firm. At first, I dismissed the letter as junk mail or perhaps an error, but upon opening it, I was stunned. The contents revealed that I was the beneficiary of an inheritance from a distant relative, someone I scarcely remembered meeting. It turned out my great-uncle Robert, a recluse living across the country, had passed away, leaving me a staggering sum of $3 million. Sitting in disbelief, I read and reread the letter. My memories of Uncle Robert were faint at best. Just brief encounters at a family reunion during my childhood. We had lost touch over the years, and I couldn't fathom why he would leave me such a fortune. The letter hinted at his reasons. He admired my independence and the way I carved out my life without leaning on others. It seemed he had kept tabs on me from a distance, respecting my resilience. The next few days felt like a whirlwind as I reached out to the law firm to validate the claim and began the inheritance process. The transition was surreal, as if lifted from a film script. Overnight, I went from just getting by to managing a fortune. Yet, as I adjusted to this new reality, unexpected complexities emerged. News of the inheritance spread rapidly, though I had only shared it with a few close friends. Soon enough, my family caught wind of it. The initial call was from my mom, who had been relatively distant since I moved out, save for sporadic texts and holiday greetings. However, her sudden surge of affection and interest didn't sit right with me. Her voice was overly sweet as she inquired about my well-being and expressed her longing to reconnect. I sensed an ulterior motive. My mom had never been one to initiate contact without needing something. After several minutes of forced pleasantries, she broached the subject. "I heard about Uncle Robert's inheritance," she mentioned casually, though the undertone of her words was loaded with expectation. "Yeah," I responded, unsure of how to navigate the conversation. "That's such a blessing," she continued, her voice thick with feigned joy. "You've been working so hard, and now this. I'm so happy for you." I paused, anticipating the pivot in our conversation, which inevitably came. "You know," she added, "things have been a bit tight for John and me lately. He's been out of work for a few months, and with the bills piling up, well, I was hoping maybe you could help us out a little." There it was, the ask I had foreseen, yet its sting was sharp all the same. I hadn't had any contact with John or Ryan in years, and now, suddenly, They were reaching out, but only because of my money. I attempted to explain that I was still deciding what to do with the inheritance, that I needed time to think, but my mother persisted. She layered on guilt, recounting the supposed sacrifices they had made for me, claiming they had always supported me, a gross exaggeration. When I didn't immediately acquiesce, she turned sharp. "You're being selfish," she snapped. "You have more money than you could ever need, and we're just struggling to get by? Don't you think you owe us something? After all we've done for you?" I was torn. My instincts pulled me away from simply handing out money, especially given our strained relationship, not to mention my doubts about their genuine concern for me. It seemed all about the money. After a tense exchange, I ended the call, stating I needed time to think. That call was merely the opening salvo. Over the ensuing days, the barrage of requests began. John phoned next, his tone gruff and entitled. We could really use some help with the mortgage," he grumbled. "It's the least you could do after everything we did for you growing up." Ryan, who I hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly reemerged, feigning camaraderie. "Hey, man," his voice overly friendly, oozing insincerity. "Heard about your big windfall. That's awesome. I've been thinking about starting a business, and with just a little help from you, I could really get it off the ground." The floodgates indeed had opened. Relatives I hadn't communicated with for years, cousins, aunts, uncles, and even distant acquaintances all surfaced with tales of hardship, each angling for a slice of my newfound wealth. Initially, I tried to remain polite, explaining that I hadn't made any decisions yet, hoping to stem the tide of requests. The requests soon escalated into demands, transforming people who had previously shown little interest in me into opportunists, viewing me as a walking ATM. The relentless pressure was suffocating, and just when I thought it couldn't get worse, it did. One unsettling night, I received a call from my cousin Jess. Jess and I had never been close, our paths too divergent. She was the perennial party girl, always in some drama, while I had stayed the course, focused and hardworking. Her call caught me off guard, her voice frantic and laden with desperation. "I need your help," she pleaded, her tone trembling. I was cautious. "What kind of trouble?" I asked. "I owe money," she confessed, "to some really bad people. If I don't pay them back soon, I'm scared of what they might do." The fear in her voice struck a chord in me, momentarily stirring my sympathy, but then memories of past calls flooded back, each one laced with manipulation, and suspicion clouded my judgment. "I'm sorry, Jess," I replied, my voice firm, "but I can't just give you money." Her response was immediate and emotional. She cried, begged, claiming I was her last hope. Her words, designed to pull at my heartstrings, instead reminded me of the hard lessons I'd learned, and people would say anything to get. When I stood my ground, Jess's desperation turned to anger. She screamed, hurling insults, accusing me of thinking I was above the family. "You think you're better than us now, don't you? Just because you lucked into this inheritance, you think you don't need us anymore?" I ended the call, shaken by her venomous words. I had braced myself for requests from my mom, John, and Ryan. Those were somewhat anticipated. But Jess's threatening desperation marked a new low. Overwhelmed, I began to withdraw, screening calls and ignoring messages, seeking refuge in isolation from the relentless emotional manipulation. Yet, despite shutting them out, a lingering guilt remained, gnawing at me with the persistent question, what if Jess really was in danger? Torn between competing desires, I struggled internally. On one hand, I wanted to safeguard my future by holding on to the inheritance. On the other, I grappled with guilt, wondering if withholding assistance from my family was selfish. The tension culminated when my mom appeared at my apartment unexpectedly after weeks of silence. Her eyes brimming with tears, she stood at my doorstep, a picture of despair. "I just want to talk," she pleaded, her voice quaking. Reluctantly, I let her in. We sat in awkward silence as she wept, leaving me at a loss for words. Eventually, she composed herself enough to speak about the hardships she and John were enduring, their battle to keep their home, and the uncertainty of their... "I'm your mother," she implored, her eyes searching mine for compassion. "I raised you. I took care of you. Don't you think you owe me something for all..." The familiar pang of guilt tried to assert itself, but I resisted. Years of manipulation had taught me the importance of boundaries. "I love you, Mom," I said, striving for composure, "but I can't just hand over money because you're my mother. I need to do what's best." Her expression shifted as if I had betrayed her. "You've changed," she murmured, a mix of shock and sadness in her tone. "You're not the son I remember." With those words, she left, her departure echoing in the hollow silence of my apartment. As the door shut behind her, I was enveloped by a bittersweet sense of relief and sorrow. Despite the pain, I knew I had made the right decision, though it didn't ease the difficulty of the moment. In the following months, I further distanced myself from my family. The relentless calls and demands gradually ceased and a semblance of peace returned, but the emotional scars lingered. The inheritance had liberated me in many ways, yet it extracted a heavy price: my relationship with my family. As the initial turmoil subsided and quiet settled in, I wondered if that confrontation with my mother marked the end of our strife, but the silence that followed seemed as heavy and profound as any argument, a sobering reminder of the cost of newfound independence. The brief respite had given me hope that perhaps my family had resigned themselves to the fact that I wasn't an open wallet. For a few peaceful weeks, I could breathe easier, free from the oppressive guilt and manipulation that had shadowed my recent days. However, that peace proved fleeting. One unsettling afternoon, I received a letter from a lawyer representing my stepfather, John. It was a formal demand for a portion of my inheritance, asserting that both he and my mother were entitled to some of the money. Though the letter was dense with legal terms I barely understood, its intent was unmistakable. They were prepared to sue if I did not comply. The shock of it felt like a physical blow. It wasn't enough that my family had tried to emotionally blackmail me. Now they were resorting to legal threats over money that was never theirs. This realization ignited a fury in me that had been simmering under the surface. I promptly contacted a lawyer, a family friend named Ben, whom I trusted deeply. As I detailed the events of the past months, my emotional turmoil, and now this legal threat, Ben listened with a calm that contrasted sharply with my distress. After I finished, he provided the reassurance I desperately needed. "They don't have a legal leg to stand on," Ben confirmed, echoing my suspicions. "There's no legal basis for them to simply demand a part of your inheritance. If this goes to court, we'll fight it and we'll win." His words, though comforting, didn't fully alleviate my frustration. The notion that my family would go to such lengths to drag me through legal proceedings for financial gain was profoundly upsetting. It felt like a profound betrayal, the kind that reshapes how you view people you once loved. Undeterred by legal ethics or familial bonds, John and my mother pressed forward with their lawsuit, claiming entitlement to the inheritance because of the support they had provided during my upbringing. This move to legally claim a part of my life's unexpected fortune was not just a battle over money. It was a test of my resolve and a stark revelation of their true intention. The absurdity of the situation was almost laughable. Here I was, having left their home at 18 and been self-sufficient ever since, now entangled in a legal battle spun from their twisted narrative. The lawsuit stretched on for months, each day a grueling reminder of the lengths they were willing to go. Though Ben reassured me of our strong position, the ordeal was relentlessly taxing, filled with depositions, endless paperwork, and a barrage of legal maneuvers that consumed my life. Amidst this chaos, the bitterness toward my family deepened. They had transformed what should have been a joyous inheritance into an ongoing nightmare. However, a turning point arrived one afternoon when Ben called with a crucial update. His investigation had unearthed significant irregularities in how John and my mother filed their claim. It was worse than we thought. They had based their entire case on fraudulent documents. They had doctored records to fabricate claims of financial support that never existed. The shock of their willingness to forge documents to manipulate the situation was a stark revelation of their true character. Ben wasted no time. He filed a counterclaim for their attempt to defraud me. The judge's decision came swiftly once the evidence was reviewed. The lawsuit was dismissed, and John and my mother were penalized with heavy legal fines for their fraudulent actions. The sense of vindication was profound. After months of stress and anxiety, justice had prevailed, not only vindicating me, but also penalizing them for their deceit. The relief was palpable, like a massive weight lifted from my shoulders. Throughout the ordeal, I had wrestled with guilt and doubt, but this outcome affirmed my decision to protect my inheritance. Yet, the victory was bittersweet. The familial bonds I once valued were irreparably damaged. Trust had been obliterated, and I resolved never to allow them back into my life. In the quiet after the storm, I made a conscious decision to focus on rebuilding my life. It became clear that the protracted focus on the lawsuit and my family's demands had prevented me from truly living. Now, freed from these burdens, I was ready to start anew, to experience life unencumbered by the shadows of the past. Emerging from survival mode, I was ready to thrive. One of the first steps in this new chapter was to reconnect with my younger half-brother Josh. He was the son of my mom and John, and our relationship had been distant, largely due to the complex family dynamics that always seemed to place him in the middle. I hadn't really known how to bridge the gap between us. But the ordeal of the lawsuit shifted my perspective. I didn't want to sever all ties with my family. Josh and I began communicating more frequently, and I was pleasantly surprised to find that we shared many similarities. He had always been more reserved, a quiet observer in the family, much like I had been. During our conversations, he shared his feelings of exclusion, particularly how John had always shown a clear preference for Ryan. It was like listening to a reflection of my own experiences, but through a different lens. We started to meet for coffee, discussing life, and gradually mending our relationship. The process was challenging, laden with emotional hurdles, but I discovered a genuine connection and trust in Josh. He had stayed clear of the lawsuit and the manipulative schemes, a fact for which I was immensely thankful. As Josh and I rebuilt our bond, I also found unexpected support elsewhere. My friends, steadfast through the legal tumult, became my chosen family, proving that kinship isn't solely about blood ties, but about who stands by you in adversity. Among these friends was Emily, a co-worker whose friendship had deepened significantly during the lawsuit. We had always been amicable, but the trials of the lawsuit brought us closer. Emily was a constant during my most challenging times, offering a listening ear and unwavering support. As our friendship grew, so did my feelings for her. Initially, I was cautious, wary of embarkship amid such personal upheaval. However, Emily's patience and empathy eventually persuaded me to explore the possibility of something more. I started dating, and it felt like a breath of fresh sign that life was beginning to normalize. The lawsuit resolved, my strengthening relationship with Josh. I was not just recovering, I was actively building a new life. This period marked a significant one where I learned the true essence of family and love and began to appreciate the peace that comes with regaining control of my life. Felt liberating, as if the relentless chaos that had engulfed me was finally receding. Yet, the journey wasn't devoid of turbulence. There were moments of doubt, times when the scars of past manipulations threatened to drag me back into familiar cycles of guilt and anxiety. Through these trials, however, I had garnered a crucial lesson. I was not defined by my family's past actions. I possessed the autonomy to forge my path and choose the company of those who genuinely valued me. This understanding transformed my perspective on the inheritance. It wasn't merely about the financial gain, but a lesson in self-assertion, boundary setting, and self-worth. The ordeal had been arduous, marred by conflict and betrayal, yet it had also guided me to those who mattered most: Josh, Emily, and the steadfast friends who supported me throughout. Post-lawsuit life was imperfect but wholly mine, a reality I embraced wholeheartedly. My bond with Josh deepened, and Emily became an integral part of my life, offering a sense of support and understanding I had long craved. Just when I thought stability had been restored and the chaos left behind, life unveiled yet another twist. A message from a woman named Rebecca arrived unexpectedly, claiming she was my half-sister. Skeptical at first, my doubts began to wane when she shared a photo of an old letter written by the father I had never known. The letter, mentioning both our names, was undeniable proof of her claim. Stunned by the revelation of a sibling I never knew existed, I was compelled by a mix of shock and curiosity. Rebecca detailed her long search for me, her story resonating with authenticity. Driven by curiosity and a burgeoning connection, I agreed to meet her. Sitting across from Rebecca, it was like glimpsing a parallel life, a life where our paths might have crossed under different circumstances. She too had grown up without our father, piecing together his elusive past, fragments left behind. Our conversation stretched for hours as we exchanged life stories and puzzled over our shared heritage. It was a surreal realization. While I navigated my own familial challenges, an entire branch of my family tree had remained unknown, unfolding in parallel yet untouched by my own experience. As Rebecca and I grew closer, she unveiled yet another stunning revelation. Our father had left her a significant inheritance too. However, it had been in limbo because she was unable to locate me, the co-beneficiary. Just when I thought life had run out of surprises, here was another twist involving an inheritance from the father I never really knew. This time, though, it wasn't about the money. It was about forging a connection with a part of my life that had always felt missing. Rebecca and I decided to split the inheritance evenly, but more importantly, we committed to remaining a part of each other's lives. Amidst the history of pain and manipulation that characterized our past, this was an opportunity to cultivate a genuine familial bond, one that had eluded me for so long. Over time, I embraced the understanding that family isn't necessarily defined by blood or duty, but by the choice to support each other. My connections with Josh, Emily, and now Rebecca, people who cared without conditions, were the true embodiments of family. Though life was far from perfect, it was rich with these authentic relationships, more valuable than any financial gain. Life seemed to have stabilized, and I felt content with how things had unfolded. Emily and I were solid, and my relationship with Josh had filled the familial void I had experienced for years. Everything appeared calm, a stark contrast to the upheavals of the past. However, just as I settled into this peace, an unexpected visitor arrived at my doorstep. A private investigator, his appearance marked by years and fatigue, stood before me, claiming he had been searching for me. Initially, I was wary, suspecting another complication related to my family or perhaps someone prying into my financial matters. The investigator revealed that during the lawsuit, John had employed him to dig up dirt that could be used against me. Yet, in his investigations, he stumbled upon a revelation that not even John had anticipated. My father, the man who had vanished from my life when I was just a baby, had not simply faded into obscurity. What the investigator discovered next was poised to once again reshape my understanding of my past and my family's history. The unfolding truths promised to reveal more about my father's mysterious disappearance and potentially open up new chapters in the story of my life. Upon learning that my father had been living just a few towns away under a new identity, concealing himself from debts and legal issues, I was stunned. The private investigator handed me a file containing my father's new name, address, and an unsent note that read, "I've always watched from afar. I'm proud of who you've become." The discovery left me grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. The man who had abandoned me, whose absence had defined much of my life, was now within my grasp. Should I confront him, demand explanations, or was it better to let the past remain just that? Encouraged by Emily, I wrestled with these questions until I decided to face him. Standing before his modest, dilapidated house, I nearly retreated, but as the door swung open, revealing an older, frailer man than I had envisioned, my resolve hardened. He was unmistakably my father. We sat together enveloped in a heavy silence until he began to speak. He recounted his regrets and mistakes and described how he had observed my life from afar, always too ashamed to make contact. While his words did not erase the years of pain his absence had caused, they allowed me to release much of the anger I had harbored. Ultimately, the encounter did not provide the fatherly connection I had longed for, but it offered something perhaps more significant: closure. As I left his home, I recognized a profound truth. My completeness did not depend on his presence. My life was already enriched by the genuine relationships I had cultivated with Josh, Emily, and Rebecca. Driving home, my thoughts coalesced into a realization about life's inherent messiness and unpredictability. It isn't defined by the losses we suffer or the pain inflicted upon us, but by the relationships we choose to foster and the life we consciously build amidst the chaos. For the first time in many years, a sense of liberation washed over me, a feeling of true freedom.